The White Witch of Spiton and the Serpent of Anata, Chapter 1. Black Pond. The thick roots of the water lilies wrapped themselves tightly around William's ankles, entangling him like the coils of deadly constricting pythons. The more he tugged to loosen their suffocating grip, the tighter they became. His head bobbed above the water for a split second and then went under as he fought for his life. William had just celebrated his 13th birthday. It was hot, sticky, and Josie, his mother, had warned him of the dangers of swimming in Black Pond. Bicycles rested on the bank as distraught friends screamed for William to break free and swim to safety. "William!" shouted Sally in floods of tears. "Kick your legs harder and swim!" But her sensible words were distorted after his sudden submersion. William opened his eyes slightly, watching the confused fish gawping at him. As they could breathe so easily in the water, they seemed to be wondering why this human couldn't do likewise. William was swallowing countless mouthfuls of horrible smelly water. He coughed and spluttered, feeling sick and weary. His friends cried out to him that they would fetch help, but he had given up his fight for life, and all he wanted was to float down to the soft, muddy bed below. He caught a glimpse of Sally standing alone, screaming and shouting words of encouragement. His other friends had run off to find much-needed help, but his eyes had grown heavy, and he desperately wanted to rest his tired limbs. "No!" hollered Sally. "William, please keep swimming. James and Nigel have gone off to fetch someone. I know they'll be back soon." William's waterlogged ears only half grasped of faint words, and although he got the gist of Sally's crucial message, his tired, heavy arms suddenly lowered to his side, and he slowly began to sink. At that moment, young Isabel Ashwell suddenly arrived with William's breathless and very distraught friends. Seeing William's predicament, she focused her mind on him and concentrated hard. Using her magic powers to free him, she shouted, "Escape us, freemus!" The snake-like vines slowly began to unravel and loosen their grip. William was able at last to kick his legs freely, splashing about awkwardly. Somehow he managed to swim towards the bank, crawl onto dry land and sit shivering. "What were you doing?" asked Isabel sternly. "You could have drowned. Don't you know how dangerous this pond is?" "I know," said William, panting, "but I was trying to help this boy. He said he'd lost something in the pond and he couldn't swim." "Boy? What boy? What was his name?" she asked. "I don't know," said William. "He had dark hair and a long fringe. He spoke a bit posh. He was much older than me." "What was he looking for?" asked Isabel. "A snake," said William. "A gold snake, and it's got black eyes." Isabel frowned at him. "I couldn't find it, though," he continued. "The water's too muddy, and when I started to go under, he disappeared." "You'd better go home," said Isabel, "before you freeze to death. And never go into the pond again. Next time you might not be so lucky." "Cheers," said William, wheeling his bike alongside his thankful friends. Isabel decided to visit her grandma Lilith and find out more about the mysterious black-eyed snake. Eagerly she telephoned Lilith, who told Isabel she had arranged to visit Lady Ludroth to meet them both at Moon Manor that evening. Edith, Lady Ludroth's elderly maid, opened the solid oak door. "Bonjour, Isabel," she said feebly, her head nodding up and down on her bony chest. "Madame waits for vous dans la lounge." She shuffled slowly along in front of Isabel, leading the way to the grand sitting room. Isabel took a step, stopped and took another, and then waited. Moon Manor always had the same lingering musty odour, but she couldn't fathom out whether it was antique furniture or poor old Edith. But although the manor was extremely cobwebbed and musty, she always enjoyed visiting her dear friend, Lady Ludroth. Edith turned the iron handle, slowly opening the large wooden door. Lady Ludroth and Lilith were sipping glasses of sherry and seemed to be engaged in serious conversation. "Yes, I've heard a whisper that Carlag tried to summon creatures to rescue him from his banishment," said Lady Ludroth despondently. "But the silly man is completely wasting his time and what little powers he has left." Carlad's capabilities are not to be underestimated, Lucinda, warned Lilith. Isabel is here, madame, interrupted Edith, shuffling into the room. Ah, said Lady Ludroth happily, a bright smile sweeping across her face. How lovely to see you, dear. Lilith and I were just speaking about your defeated arch-enemy, Carlad. Yes, I thought so, said Isabel. So do you think he'll find a way to return to Spiton? Absolutely not, said Lilith, hugging her warmly. I really don't care what. I really don't think we have anything to worry about, Isabel. Isabel wasn't entirely convinced by Lilith's vague reassurance. But you said we shouldn't underestimate Carlet's powers, she said. Well, yes, I did, said Lilith awkwardly, realising Isabel had overheard their conversation. But your magical abilities are far stronger, she said encouragingly. Come on now. You said you had something important to tell us, darling. Isabel sat on the old leather-winged armchair. Amon Ra, Lady Ludroth's ill-mannered and very spoilt Siamese cat, lazily opened one eye, raised his elegant head, and yawned to reveal his gleaming pointed fangs. He stared at Isabel as though she had rudely interrupted his peaceful catnap, and then snuggled back into his luxurious crushed velvet blanket. Amon Ra's jewelled collar twinkled in the light of the burning log fire. Drink, dear? Asked Lady Ludroth, revealing her small glass. No, thank you, said Isabel. I rescued a boy called William today. He nearly drowned swimming in Black Pond. Swimming? Said Lady Ludroth, astounded. Silly boy. He obviously doesn't realise how dangerous Black Pond is. He's lucky you came to his rescue. Well done, Isabel, said Lilith. But what possessed him to swim in the pond in the first place? Apparently an older boy, who I must admit sounds like Nemo, asked him to look for a gold snake with jet black eyes. Lady Ludroth and Lilith simultaneously drew deep breaths and instantly glared at each other. Lady Ludroth gulped down her sherry, almost choking on it, and cleared her throat. Did you say a snake with black eyes, dear? Are you sure that's what he said? She asked. Yes, said Isabel. Well, that's what William told me. Lilith, dear, said Lady Ludroth, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Lilith nodded. We'd better take a close look at one of my special books. She walked towards a dusty bookshelf, pointed her long spindly finger, and ran her nail along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. She stopped when she finally reached the thickest book of them all. Taking the heavy book off the bookshelf, she blew away the thick dust and coughed. It's been a while since I had to use this one in particular, she said, placing the book on the table and turning the yellow, crumpled pages. Ah, yes, just as I thought. It's a Serpent of Anata. I was afraid you'd say that, said Lilith uneasily. Isabel gazed at the magnificent hand-drawn picture of a golden serpent spread across the centre pages. Its piercing, jet-black eyes stared uncomfortably back at her. Carefully written on its scaly skin was an inscription. What do those symbols mean? She asked. Evil shall return, said Lady Ludroth dramatically. I recall many moons ago when my grandfather, Harold Emmanuel Ludroth, journeyed to the mystical land of Egypt. He was a very famous archaeologist in his time, you know. Along with his great friend Oswald Ferdinand, he took part in the expedition and important discovery of Akhenaten's tomb. He had been deeply within the secret chamber surrounded by many costly treasures when he stumbled upon a gilded chest, and within it was priced jewels of Serpent of Anata. At the exact moment that Harold took the serpent out of its chest, the walls crumbled and fell all around them. Oh, it was awful. Poor Harold fled for his life. Isabel was fascinated and wide-eyed, listened to Lady Ludroth's intriguing story. His friend Oswald, promptly followed him, but when Harold was about to climb the rope and escape from certain death, he glanced over his shoulder to make sure Oswald was behind him, but alas, poor Oswald had disappeared and was never seen again. "And what happened to Harold?" asked Isabel, before Lady Ludroth became distracted and didn't finish the story. "Luckily, Harold escaped and returned to England with the Serpent of Anata, but apparently, in time, much bad luck and evil fell upon our family, and so he discarded the cursed relic. It's rumoured that one evening he secretly tossed it into the dark, murky waters of Black Pond, and it lies there undisturbed to this very day." At that moment there was a loud crash and an almighty bang, and Lady Ludroth's Great Dane Titus bounded excitedly into the room. He pounced clumsily at Isabel and then sat obediently at her feet, dreamily gazing into her emerald green eyes. "Titus!" shouted Lady Ludroth sternly. "You bad boy! Mummy told you to stay in your room." He lifted his enormous black and white paw, offering it to Isabel. His long, slimy tongue hung heavily from his drooling jaws. Lady Ludroth stroked his head. "Good boy, Titus. I see your manners have slightly improved." Isabel thought it best that she stroked Titus, so obligingly shook his heavy paw. "Now back to your room, there's a good boy," continued Lady Ludroth, tugging his leather collar. "Mummy has some work to do." Titus surprisingly followed his mistress out of the room. "This isn't good news, is it, Grandma?" asked Isabel glumly. Lilith walked towards the windows of Moon Manor, thoughtfully peering outside and into the vast grounds. "No, it isn't," she replied solemnly. After a brief, thoughtful silence, Lady Ludroth unexpectedly flew back into the room, looking as though Titus had dragged her through a hedge backwards. "That dreadful dog!" she cursed breathlessly. "I simply don't know what to do with him. He spotted a field mouse scurrying through the grand hall and dragged me on a wild goose chase." Lilith's contemplative expression changed into an amused grin, and she laughed heartily. Lady Ludroth, however, was not amused, and tidied her dishevelled hair. "Perhaps you should have got a small poodle," laughed Lilith. "They're far easier to train and manage, Lucinda." "Certainly not," said Lady Ludroth adamantly. "I couldn't stand a little ankle-biter around me. I admit Titus needs a little training, but that's all really. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the Serpent of Anata." "You said Harold searched for the tomb of Akhenaten?" asked Isabel. "Yes, that's right, dear. Akhenaten was the most powerful pharaoh and was murdered by an evil high priestess, or some might call her a sorceress. Her name was Sekhmet. Sekhmet was the pharaoh's mistress and declared her child heir to the throne of Egypt. But the pharaoh's wife Isis also had a son, and of course he took precedence and was declared the rightful heir. In her rage and anger, Sekhmet took her evil revenge and murdered the pharaoh and many of her own people using deadly poisons and evil spells. Apparently, before her capture and painful death, she summoned her loyal priestess and presented them with the Serpent of Anata. She said that it was to be used to bring her back from the afterlife, but the pharaoh soldiers arrested them all. After her death, the serpent was buried with Akhenaten for fear of Sekhmet's followers discovering its potential, but thousands of years later, Harold discovered it during his dig. "Do you really believe that the serpent could bring Sekhmet back from the dead even now?" asked Isabel. "It certainly could, my dear, but who'd want to summon such an evil woman? Perish a thought," she answered, shuddering. At that moment, the heavy doors leading out to the gardens flew wide open, and an uncomfortable feeling crept over Isabel. The unexpected interruption startled Lilith too. She shivered, rubbing her cold arms. "I think there's someone listening to our conversation who relishes the thought of summoning Sekhmet from the afterlife," said Lilith suspiciously. The burning flames of the fire dimmed, looking as though they were about to go out. Edith shuffled into the room, carried on past Lady Ludroth, and then firmly slammed the heavy doors. "It is with this night and Madame did not lock the doors, please, she insisted. Thank you, dear, said Lady Ludroth, frowning. I'm afraid I'm inclined to be extremely forgetful these days, but just like Lilith, she too had her suspicions as to why the doors suddenly flew open. And it wasn't because of the forgetfulness and an extremely windy night. Right up until their conversation, it had been perfectly calm outside. Would Madame like anything else before I retire to my room? Asked Edith, already shuffling off to bed. No, thank you, dear, said Lady Ludroth. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the morning. But Edith hadn't waited for Lady Ludroth's reply, and had promptly retired. Deaf as a post, poor dear. Mind you, I don't know what gets up to in that room of hers later at night. She chatters to herself and makes rather strange noises. Goodness knows what she does. Perhaps, said Lilith, chuckling, Edith's a witch and secretly mixes potions in her cauldron. Isabel wouldn't have been at all surprised if Edith had indeed been a secret witch. Whenever she and Lilith delivered goods to Moon Manor, no sooner had they started to speak to Lady Ludroth than the heavy boxes had been unloaded from Lilith's jeep, and to their knowledge the only person who lived in Moon Manor was Edith and Lady Ludroth, and so it was very weird. We seem to have sparked someone's interest, said Lilith uneasily, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room. We'd better quickly change the subject, just for the time being anyway. I absolutely agree, dear, said Lady Ludroth, snapping the magic book shut and sending dust particles into the air. Let's keep this little conversation under our hat, shall we? No need to worry, said Isabel reassuringly. I won't tell anyone. Lady Ludroth coughed and then hiccuped. Oh, I'm frightfully sorry, she said. I think I may have had one or too many glasses of sherry. You hold your liquor far better than I do, Lilith. Time for bed, I feel. She hooked her arms around Lilith's and Isabel's shoulders, politely showing them to the door. We're not as young as we used to be, Lilith. I remember when I drank your grandmother under the table with 6 glasses of homemade mead, she said to Isabel. Lilith smiled at her affectionately, remembering their youth. Safe journey home, my dears, said Lady Ludroth. Lilith crunched the gears of the jeep and wound down the window to let in the cool night air. It had been a hot day, and although it was late, it was still warm. It's been a nice day, she said. My poor old cat Abacus stayed in the shade of the cherry tree, but he still panted like a tired old man. I think all that extra weight makes his blood boil, she said fondly. Isabel laughed, imagining poor Abacus puffing and panting, and his belly wobbling like a bowl of jelly. Lilith had tried very hard to get him to lose weight, frequently cutting down on his food, but Abacus quickly charmed his way into a nearby neighbour's house, and they fed him regular tidbits. That cat loves his food, Grandma, said Isabel, pausing and then taking a deep breath. The story of the Serpent of Anata, do you think Harold really threw it back into the pond? I mean, were there witnesses to prove that he did? She asked. Lilith slowed down outside Isabel's home. No one's certain, said Lilith. He may have buried it somewhere else, for all we know, and simply fooled everyone into believing that he threw it into Black Pond. Your guess is as good as mine, she said as Isabel stepped out of the vehicle and walked towards the door. Good night, Grandma, said Isabel. She thought of the mysterious boy who had cruelly encouraged William to venture into Black Pond, without thought or consideration for his life, and her mind wandered to Harold, the adventurous explorer, an archaeologist who had discovered the Serpent of Anata. Egypt was indeed a land of intrigue and mystery, magic and spells, mysterious plots and murders. For centuries it had touched many people's lives and given fame and fortune to many. But it had also cursed those who were unwelcome and had taken lives, as it had done to Oswald Ferdinand all those years ago. And now The magical land of Egypt was reaching out to touch the life of a young witch who lived in the sleepy village of Spiton.